Welcome to Beyond the Backroads.
Welcome back to Beyond the Backroads, Episode 6, Hellgate, Montana, the town built on blood and bones. Before Missoula existed, before paved roads cut through western Montana, before breweries, college campuses, coffee shops, and neighborhoods spread across the valley, there was Hellgate. And according to the people who passed through it, the name wasn't an exaggeration.
Today, most people driving through Missoula have no idea they're moving through a land layered with stories older than the city itself. Stories tied to trappers, frontier violence, disappearances, executions, and settlement that gained a reputation long before Montana officially became a state.
Modern Missoula feels alive, busy, connected, but long before any of that existed, this valley was isolated, wild, difficult to survive in during winter, and dangerous in ways people today rarely experience firsthand.
The original settlement sat near the Clark Fork River along an important travel corridor through western Montana. People moving west passed through here because they had to. Fur traders, miners, missionaries, prospectors chasing rumors of gold.
And frontier settlements like Hellgate weren't built because people wanted comfort. They were built because people needed somewhere to stop before continuing deeper into dangerous territory.
Which meant the people arriving there often carried desperation with them. Some were searching for wealth. Some were escaping something. Some had nowhere else to go.
And places filled with desperate people tend to develop rough reputations quickly, especially when law enforcement barely exists.
The original name wasn't technically Hellgate. It evolved over time through translation and misunderstanding. The Salish people referred to the area using language describing the difficult mountain passage through the valley, a dangerous route, a hard crossing.
French trappers later translated the phrase into Porte de l'Enfer, the gate of hell, Hellgate. And once that name spread among settlers, it stayed.
Even earlier trappers described the area as intimidating, not haunting necessarily, just unforgiving.
Narrow valleys, harsh winters, flooding rivers, long isolated trails where travelers could disappear for days without anyone noticing.
And in frontier Montana, disappearing wasn't uncommon.
The farther west settlers moved, the farther they got from organized law, which meant disputes were often settled privately, violently.
Some historical accounts describe Hellgate as rough even by frontier standards. Saloons filled with miners carrying gold dust, gamblers, transient workers, men who trusted nobody because survival depended on it.
And where money, alcohol, and isolation mix together, violence usually follows. By the early 1860s, Hellgate had become one of the first organized settlements in western Montana. Not large, but important.
It sat along travel routes connecting mining camps and trade corridors, which meant almost everyone moving through western Montana eventually had to pass near it.
The settlement itself was rough and temporary in appearance. Cabins built quickly from local timber, mud roads turning nearly impassable after rain, canvas-covered trading posts, improvised saloons.
And despite its small size, the area gained a reputation quickly because frontier settlements developed identities fast. Some become known for trade, some for religion, some for stability.
Hellgate became known for danger.
Historical accounts mention gambling disputes escalating into shootings, travelers being robbed outside town limits, men vanishing after arguments over mining claims.
And because proper law enforcement barely existed, justice depended largely on whoever had influence locally, or whoever had enough armed men standing beside them.
One local account describes travelers refusing to stop overnight in Hellgate unless absolutely necessary, instead choosing to continue through dangerous terrain after dark rather than remain there longer than needed.
Which tells you something important, because frontier travelers already accepted danger as normal. So if even they avoided certain places, those places probably earned their reputation honestly.
One of the darkest parts of Hellgate's history involved vigilante justice, because formal courts were rare in frontier Montana, and isolated settlements often handled punishment themselves.
Horse thieves, robbery suspects, murder accusations, people accused of threatening the community. Executions happened publicly, fast, sometimes without much investigation at all.
And according to local historical accounts, some hangings took place near large cottonwood trees outside the settlement, visible enough that travelers arriving in town would immediately understand the warning.
Bodies were occasionally left hanging for extended periods as intimidation, a message from the settlement itself. This is what happens here.
And frontier justice wasn't always accurate. That's another important detail, because accusations alone could become enough to isolated communities under pressure.
Which means some people likely died without proof, without trials, without anyone outside the valley even knowing their names afterward.
And places where death becomes routine tend to develop legends afterwards, especially when many of those deaths happen violently and publicly.
One thing modern history often softens about frontier towns is how violent they really were. Movies romanticize them. Books turn them into adventure stories. But actual frontier settlements were unstable environments filled with armed people under constant pressure.
Resources were limited. Medical care was almost non-existent. Winter killed people regularly, and many settlers carried trauma long before arriving there.
Which meant conflicts escalated quickly, especially in isolated areas where consequences felt far away.
And western Montana during the 1860s was still developing rapidly because of mining expansion nearby. Gold discoveries brought huge numbers of people into areas that weren't prepared for them.
And sudden population growth almost always increases violence historically, especially where infrastructure can't keep pace.
Some of the oldest stories tied to Hellgate involve disappearances, travelers who never reached their destination, miners who vanished after claiming large strikes, men last seen leaving saloons at night who never appeared again.
And because records from that period were inconsistent, many stories survive only through local folklore, not official documentation.
One legend describes a prospector who reportedly won a large amount of gold during gambling games in Hellgate before disappearing along the river trail days later. His horse returned without him.
Another story involves a trapper found dead near the riverbank during spring thaw after being missing all winter. Locals suspected robbery, but nobody was ever charged. Eventually, another settlement began growing nearby, a location with better opportunity for expansion, better transportation access, better long-term survival potential. That settlement would eventually become Missoula.
And slowly, Hellgate started fading. Not dramatically, not overnight, just gradually. Businesses relocated, families moved, trade routes shifted.
That's how many frontier settlements disappeared. Not through disaster, but through irrelevance. Once another location offered more stability, people left.
And eventually, what remained of Hellgate became more reputation than reality. Stories, old foundations, roads that no longer existed clearly, fragments of history scattered across the valley.
But according to local historians, The identity of the settlement never fully disappeared from the land itself, because the original violence tied to Hellgate remained connected to the area long after the buildings were gone.
That's something that happens after with frontier towns. Physical structures disappear, but folklore survives much longer, especially when the stories involve death, executions, disappearances.
And because modern Missoula grew over parts of the same landscape, people started connecting unusual experiences back to Hellgate itself. Not necessarily because they believed in ghosts, but because the history already made the area feel heavy.
One reason people believe areas surrounding Old Hellgate feel haunted is because nobody fully knows where all the graves are. And that's not unusual for frontier settlements.
Burials happened quickly back then, especially during winter, or disease outbreaks or after violent incidents. People were often buried near settlements using temporary markers that didn't survive over time.
Wooden crosses, simple stones, unmarked graves, things easily lost once weather and decades erased them.
And when settlements disappeared, many burial locations disappeared with them, especially when maps weren't precise.
Some local historians believe portions of modern Missoula may overlap forgotten burial areas tied to the original Hellgate settlement. Not formal cemeteries necessarily, just isolated graves spread across the old traveled corridor and settlement boundaries.
One local story describes construction workers reportedly uncovering old human remains during development projects decades ago. Stories like that circulate quietly in older communities, never fully verified publicly, but repeated enough that people remember them.
And whether those stories are true or exaggerated, the idea itself affects how people view the area. Because once people believe forgotten graves exist somewhere nearby, every strange experience starts feeling connected to them.
Especially in places where violent deaths were already common historically.
The Clark Fork River appears consistently in stories tied to Hellgate, not just because the settlement sat near it, but because rivers were dangerous on the frontier.
Especially during spring runoff, water levels rose quickly, currents became violent, and if someone disappeared near the river, recovery wasn't guaranteed.
Which made rivers useful for more than transportation, according to local folklore. They also became places where evidence disappeared.
Some stories claim robbery victims were thrown into the river after disputes involving gambling or gold. Others describe bodies found months later downstream after winter thaw exposed them.
One old legend describes a trapper who disappeared after winning heavily during card games in Hellgate. Witnesses reportedly saw him leave town alone late at night, carrying gold dust. His horse returned days later without him.
Another story tells of two men arguing near the riverbank after drinking heavily at a saloon. Only one returned to town afterward. The second man was never seen again.
And because record keeping was inconsistent, stories like that often survived only through oral history, which makes it difficult to separate documented truth from folklore.
But even uncertain stories affect a place over time, especially when enough people repeat them for generations. Modern paranormal stories connected to Hellgate usually don't involve dramatic apparitions. They involve subtle things, shadowy figures, movement near tree lines, the feeling of being watched.
People hiking trails near areas associated with the old settlement sometimes describe seeing dark figures standing motionless between trees, usually at dusk, far enough away that details are impossible to make out.
And what unsettles people most isn't the appearance itself, it's the stillness, the way the figures don't react when noticed.
One local story describes a hunter returning to his truck after sunset when he noticed what he had thought was another person standing farther down the trail. At first, he assumed it was another hunter, but the figure never moved, never acknowledged him.
He reportedly watched it for nearly 30 seconds before shining a flashlight directly toward it, and according to the story, nothing was there anymore.
Another report hearing footsteps, following them briefly on isolated trails near old settlement boundaries, always just behind them, always stopping the moment they stop walking.
And because the original settlement no longer physically exists in a preserved form, the haunting stories feel scattered across the landscape itself, not tied to one building, not tied to one road, but tied to the entire valley.
Travel routes through western Montana mattered enormously during the frontier period, and some local historians believe portions of the old Mullen Road passed through the areas connected to Hellgate.
Which meant the settlement saw constant movement: travelers carrying supplies, miners transporting gold, freight wagons moving between camps.
And isolated roads created opportunities for violence because robbing someone outside town limits was far easier than inside crowded settlements.
Bandits weren't uncommon on frontier roads, especially in territories where law enforcement remained limited.
One local story describes a freight driver who disappeared while transporting supplies through the valley during the winter. His wagon was later found abandoned along the trail, but he was never located.
Another legend involves travelers hearing horse hooves following them along old roads near the settlement late at night, only for the sound to stop whenever they turned around.
And stories involving phantom riders appeared frequently in frontier folklore across western United States, especially in places historically tied to violent deaths or disappearances.
People visiting areas associated with Old Hellgate often describe something difficult to explain. Not dramatic hauntings, not obvious paranormal activity, just discomfort.
A feeling that the landscape itself carries tension somehow.
And psychologists would probably explain that through environmental factors: isolation, history, suggestion, the knowledge of violence connected to the area.
But believers argue something else entirely. The repeated violence leaves impressions behind. But believers argue something else entirely. That repeated violence leaves impressions behind, that places absorb emotional intensity over time.
And frontier settlements experienced enormous amounts of emotional intensity: fear, desperation, isolation, death.
Especially settlements like Hellgate, where survival itself remained uncertain constantly.
Some locals claim there are still areas near the original settlement boundaries where the atmosphere changes abruptly, where sound feels muted, where people suddenly feel watched despite being alone.
And whether those experiences are psychological or paranormal, the consistency of the stories keeps the legend alive. Older Missoula residents still occasionally reference Hellgate stories quietly, usually indirectly. Warnings about certain wooded areas, roads people avoid late at night, stories involving strange lights near the river.
Lantern lights are one of the oldest recurring details. People describing small moving lights near old trails where no roads exist anymore.
Some claim they look like old lanterns waving through trees. Others describe them hovering briefly near the riverbank before disappearing.
And because frontier settlements relied heavily on lanterns before electricity, the imagery itself feels tied to the period naturally.
Other stories involving hearing voices near isolated wooded areas late at night. Not clear conversations, just low, indistinct talking, carried briefly through the trees.
One local legend describes campers hearing what sounded like distant arguing near the river after midnight, followed by a sudden gunshot echoing through the valley. But when they searched the area, there was nobody there. Hellgate no longer exists the way it once did. The buildings disappeared, the roads changed, the settlement faded into history.
But places built on violence rarely disappear completely. Even after the physical structures are gone, the stories remain.
And stories shape how people experience places, especially places layered with death, fear, isolation.
Because before Missoula became what it is today, this valley belonged to something rougher. The frontier settlement where survival mattered more than morality sometimes, where justice happened quickly, and where some people disappeared without explanation.
Maybe the hauntings people describe are nothing more than history affecting perception. Or maybe repeated violence leaves something behind, something difficult to explain but impossible to fully erase.
And if enough people keep describing the same strange feelings, generation after generation, eventually the stories stop fading. They become part of the landscape itself.
And somewhere beneath modern Montana, Hellgate may still be waiting.
Still holding on to the people who never left.
We will see you next time.